French politics in context. Obviously, it's related to the elections, both the first round and the results, as well as what might transpire on Sunday. But also what we wanted to do with this panel is to explore the broader political context of French politics today, both the European context, international context, as well as different regional contexts that are taking shape in French politics. Obviously, this election is one of the most significant elections for a generation, perhaps even more significant than that, and it has both European and regional repercussions. And we wanted to have a panel that looks at both in a broad context, but also specific developments within the French politics. And we have a great panel. I'm going to start by introducing Raymond Kuhn. He's a professor of politics at Queen Mary University of London. Raymond is one of the UK's leading specialists on the French media. His book, Media in France, has become a key English language work on the topic. Now, Raymond studies contemporary French politics with special emphasis on the executive, political leadership, elections, political communication, and the relations between the public and the private. Raymond has recently published several pieces on political communication in Britain. He's currently working on a monograph entitled The French Media in the 21st Century, Digital and Global Challenges. Now, without Raymond's help, I would not have been able to put this panel together. Not only he's a specialist in French politics, but also he was so kind and helpful in trying to put a panel that we thought that would really serve best for what we wanted to do together. So I'm really grateful for Raymond's help for that. He's going to chair the roundtable after opening it with few initial remarks to get the discussion going. Now, our first speaker is Alistair. When I say first, I'm introducing Raymond. Will decide the order. Alistair is professor of politics at Sciences Po Lyon. Alistair studies contemporary and comparative European politics and policy, with special reference to France and Franco-British comparisons. He has been at Sciences Po Lyon since 2015. Seconded from his position as the professor of European politics, Cardiff University. He has published more than 20 books, but particularly including the most recent ones that are noteworthy: French Politics and Society and Cities as Political Objects. Next to him is Helen Drake. Helen Drake is professor of French and European Studies at Loughborough University. Helen studies France in its international context. In 2010, she was named Chevalier dans l'Ordre des Palmes Académiques by the French government for services to French culture and language. Since September 2012, Helen has been chair of the UK's leading academic association for European Studies, UASIS. She was awarded a Jean Monnet Chair in European Integration by the European Commission in September 2013, and is using this to support her teaching at Loughborough. She published work on the contemporary French population in London and on the security discourse still stigmatizing the Roma population in France. She's currently working on a monograph on France's relationship with the European Union. And to my right here, Rainbow Murray. She's a reader in politics at Queen Mary University of London. Rainbow is an expert on gender politics, representation and political institutions, with a particular focus on French politics and on British and comparative politics. She's been at Queen Mary since 2007. Her books include Parties, Gender Quotas, and Candidate Selection in France, and Cracking the Highest Glass Ceiling, Global Comparison of Women's Campaigns for Executive Office. She is now completing a book exploring the transformative effect of gender quotas on parliamentary representation. Without further ado, I'm really looking forward to this panel. We're going to hand it over to Raymond. But join me, just welcome.
Thank you very much. First of all, it's lovely to see such a large enthusiastic, intelligent, reasonable, well-educated and rational audience. You can see the campaign has had its effect on me. Many of you will have followed the campaign in depth. Some of you may well just have dipped in and out when you felt the urge. What I thought I would do in the 5 or 6 minutes that's been allocated to me is just to give an overview of some key aspects of the campaign. In a book that was published a couple of months ago by the commentator of Le Monde, Gérard Courtois, which looked at previous presidential campaigns in France. In his introduction, he entitles it Rien ne se passe comme prévu, which I suppose one might translate into English as something like expect the unexpected. And if Courtois is going to do another edition in a few years' time and to include the 2017 campaign, then this is a very, very good study of how election campaigns can throw up the unexpected. I'm going to give 10 very brief points about which I think have been characteristic of this campaign, and which perhaps once the 3 other presenters have given their short talks, we can open up a discussion if you so wish, because the point of this round table, although fake news, there is no round table, I know it, is to encourage participation from the floor. So here are just 10 points just to remind ourselves about this campaign. What's been perhaps a little bit different about 2017? First, the incumbent president, and he still is the incumbent president for a few more days, François Hollande, chose, if chose is the right word, not to stand for a second term, presumably fearing that he wouldn't win even the primary of his own party, the party of which he'd been leader for so many years. That is unprecedented in the political history of the Fifth Republic. So one might want to ask, where was Hollande in this campaign? Where was his legacy? What about the record of the last 5 years? Did that feature in the campaign at all? Would the campaign have been different, and if so, in what ways, if Hollande had stood for re-election, as, for example, Sarkozy did in 2012? A second aspect of this campaign was the way in which many of the big beasts of French politics, the names with which we've become so associated over the past few years, were eliminated, not in the presidential race, but in the race to get into the presidential race. Sarkozy, Juppé on the right, Valls, Montebourg on the left. The system of primaries, of right and left, effectively eliminating people who perhaps in the past might have had reasonable aspirations of being a presidential candidate and even aspiring to win the presidential election. A third feature of this election, in the eyes of some commentators, is the way in which the primaries selected 2 candidates, in inverted commas, from the extreme wings of their parties, close inverted commas. Fillon rather than Juppé in the case of Républicains in the runoff. Fillon standing on a platform of moral conservatism, of economic liberalism, of identity politics, very strong, for example, on the state's response to the Islamic terrorist threat. Hamon in the socialist primary, or the primary, the Belle Alliance Populaire, there's irony if ever there was in calling a primary. The Frondeur, the socialist rebel, a man who'd led various rebellions against the Hollande presidency, now representing the socialist colours and defeating Hollande's Prime Minister Manuel Valls. Did that have an impact on their respective scores? Well, the fact that they had to position themselves for the primaries to be selected, was that a disadvantage when it actually came to the presidential race itself? Something perhaps, if anyone wants to discuss that. A fourth feature of this campaign, which again is quite unexpected, was it was a 4-horse race. Often in French presidential elections, we've had 3-horse races in the first round, 3 major candidates, often 2 candidates from one side. One remembers in '95, for example, Chirac and Balladur rivaling for the candidacy of the right. But a 4-horse race, that I think is new. And a 4-horse race which meant that in the days leading up to the first round, there were, and I know that now seems like ancient history, but there were 6 possible runoff scenarios. The Macron-Le Pen might have been the favoured one, but there were others. Mélenchon-Le Pen, for example, the one which really gave the markets shivers, you know, and there must have been many people in the city of London on Sunday, April 23rd, with their fingers crossed, hoping that wouldn't be the result of the first round of the presidential election. Four main candidates in play, and not that much between them when it came to the final, or when it came to the first round result. Indeed, Mélenchon probably thinking that he might have qualified and almost refusing to recognise the reality of the first round vote for so long. A fifth feature of this campaign, neither of the two main parties having a candidate going through to the second round, neither the Républicains nor the left. The Socialists didn't have a candidate in 1969 nor in 2002, but we've not seen ever neither right nor left represented in the second round. A sixth feature, perhaps the importance of the opinion polls. Opinion polls have always been important, and of course in 2002 they were much criticised for, in inverted commas, getting it wrong, for not, in inverted commas, forecasting that Jean-Marie Le Pen would get through to the second round. Here, I'm not a particular expert in opinion polls per se, but there's a sense that a lot of French voters were looking at the polls and making decisions prior to the first round as to who they would choose, not necessarily supporting the candidate with whose views they most agreed, but a candidate who would be the most efficacious to block Le Pen, or in some cases to block a Fillon Le Pen runoff. So, particularly voters on the left, and we saw that increasingly as Amon's support declined after the televised debate of March the 20th to be overtaken by Jean-Luc Mélenchon. So the role of the opinion polls, the role of tactical voting before the first round, perhaps this is a very important feature of 2017. A seventh feature, if you look at the two candidates who go through to the second round, Macron, not just young, intelligent, gifted, and I'm told handsome, far be it from me to judge, never been elected, presenting himself as the anti-system candidate, and yet here is a man who, ENA, Vice Secretary General of the Elysee, a minister on Hollande's, the Valls government of President Hollande, a man who is not anti-system in many respects, has the classic template of a Fifth Republic serious presidentiable, with the exception that this is the first election in which he has stood. And I had to check back to see, was that a first? Because I thought maybe Pompidou hadn't had an elected post before he was elected in 1969, so I had to go through into Wikipedia, as all experts do at some point, and check that he did get a parliamentary seat. I think it was in 1967. So I think Macron is a first in that one. And the other interesting point about Macron, I think, is that, going back to a previous point I made, a lot of people voting Macron in the first round, and this is the surveys are showing this, not as a vote d'adhésion, as the French say, not a vote of engagement, but again, because they saw in him the best person to block Le Pen, and that may have consequences for his presidency if he were to win on Sunday. Eighth, Le Pen, of course. We've had a candidate of the extreme right in the second round before, but that was a surprise, and the French mobilised in 2002, and my goodness, the French media have been talking about 2002 over the past 10 days or so all the time. Why are we not reproducing 2002? Well, perhaps we can discuss that. But Le Pen in the first round, perhaps underperforming, but nonetheless securing, in terms of number of votes, a historic high, and one suspects, however well or badly she does on Sunday, that will be again a high watermark in terms of the number of votes that an extreme right-wing candidate, she would not call herself an extreme right-wing candidate, but a candidate from the radical right then would get in a French presidential election. Two final points about this year's campaign. The television debate, not new in itself. It's been a feature of presidential campaigns since 1974, Giscard Mitterrand, with the one exception of 2002 when Chirac refused to debate with Jean-Marie Le Pen. Macron was asked, would he debate with Marine Le Pen? He felt, I think, he had no alternative. After all, he'd already debated with her and other candidates and the TF1 debate on the 20th of March, and then the BFM TV debate on the 4th of April. So the debate in terms of the format wasn't new, but anybody who saw the proceedings on Wednesday, I think will have recognised that this was a very different form of exchange than the previous exchanges between Giscard Mitterrand or Chirac and Jospin in 1995, or even Hollande, Sarkozy in 2012. It's been described in the French media as a boxing match. It was certainly a televisual event which I think many French viewers just found quite physically quite difficult to endure, the 2 hours and 20 minutes or so. 16 million apparently watched it. Whether they watched it for the full 2.5 hours, I've no idea. And finally, and I know that Rainbow is going to talk about this, the parliamentary elections. In the 3 previous presidential contests, which have begun a 5-year presidential term, Chirac in 2002, Sarkozy in 2007, Hollande in 2012, those presidential victories have been followed by what we've tended to call confirmatory or ratifying parliamentary elections. That is the delivery to the incoming president of a parliamentary majority based on one single party or a very strong coalition of groupings centering on a single party. Chirac and the UMP in 2002, Sarkozy and the UMP in 2007, Hollande and the Socialists and their allies in 2012. Will that be the case in 2017? Will there be an en marche parliamentary majority elected on the coattails, if Macron is elected, on the coattails of a Macron victory on Sunday? And if it were to be Marine Le Pen, would there be a Front National parliamentary majority elected on the coattails of her presidential success? So those are 10 points, which I think Gérard Courtois, if he writes a second edition, might help him to substantiate his thesis that rien ne se passe comme prévu. Just remember, where were you a year ago, at the beginning of May 2016? Who did you think was going to be the successor to François Hollande a year ago? Who did you think 6 months ago was going to be the successor to François Hollande? At what point did you think, yeah, I now know who's going to be the next president of France? Well, that's the experts, because I suspect we were in the same position as you. A lot of us thought, I think, that whoever won the Republican primary, Juppé, Sarkozy, Fillon, was pretty much a shoo-in for the French presidency. Rien ne se passe comme prévu. Thank you. I'm now going to hand over to Alistair. Alistair.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks for inviting me here. What I propose to do here today is to take French politics in the context of recent presidential elections, particularly focusing on this one, of course, but trying to sort of frame a little bit historically, perhaps. Partly in order to speak about this extraordinary last few months that has contradicted everything we've all said in public frequently, so that's been fun. But also, and Ray intimated on this, the fact that really no one honestly would have said that we would have today Macron on the verge of being elected president. Well, some would have said that, but I don't think many would. So my French politics in context, what I want to do is give, in a way, 3 contexts. Okay, I want to give a historical institutional context, looking at the French presidential elections since, say, 2002. I want to give what I'd call, I suppose, a situational context, which is a bit more than the election campaign. It's the sort of cluster of events, the policy agenda to some extent that's framed this particular election, and then say something about the campaign. I'm not going to look into the future because we're going to have other takes on that. And I think the first thing to say about the institutional context is it's a basic point, really. But if we think about the institutions of the Fifth Republic, in particular the presidential institutions, then we have to say that, because we're taking 15 years as the broad frame here, we have to say that the institutions are in somewhat of a quandary, maybe in somewhat of a crisis. And it's certainly true that the last 2 presidents, President Sarkozy and President Hollande, have been extremely unpopular very quickly. That the inversion and that the introduction of the quinquennat, the 5-year term, has clearly politicized and changed somewhat the nature of the presidential office. It's meant that presidents have become more deeply unpopular more quickly, and they've been unable to recover. Obviously, there's not purely an institutional argument. There are factors underpinning this economic crisis for Sarkozy, a deeply divided party for Hollande. But they've had a sort of an input into the institution itself of the presidency. And it might be said, the traditional parties that we would have argued are the presidential parties, the Socialists and the Republicans, to summarise. And as Ray said, neither of those parties are present on the second round, which is a priori surprising. And I admit that I thought the victor of the Republican primary would go on to win the election. I thought when Fillon won that primary, then the game was up basically, and Fillon was there. But I was wrong, and it's good to be wrong. But so I think in a way we have somewhat of a crisis of institutions, but also somewhat of a crisis of representative mediators, if you like, or formal party institutions. And it's clear that both the leading parties, particularly the Socialists, but also the Republicans, are really in a difficult position at the moment. It's premature, particularly for the Republicans, to write them off, and they might well come back in the parliamentary elections. But clearly, both of those key, in a way, traditional presidential parties are in a difficult position. So that's the point I wanted to make about institutions. Then moving on to make what I call, in a way, the situational context, which is really the sort of cluster of issues that are important in any particular presidential election. If we think back to 2002, 2002 was all about security or insecurity. People were surprised, clearly, that Le Pen got through to the second round, but that campaign was dominated by issues of crime, security. They were high up the voters' agenda. 2007, security remained important, but the broader promise of far-reaching socio-economic change, perhaps embodied in Sarkozy, was important. It went beyond the narrow focus on security. 2012, the economic crisis has arrived, and clearly the key issues are social and economic ones. The public policy mood was a somber one. The French people were worried by globalization, but there's a clear sense of an agenda. In the summer of 2016, I thought, again being a bit wrong, I thought that the cluster of issues that would dominate the campaign in 2017 were, broadly speaking, the Republic in danger. Broadly speaking, terrorism, identity, immigration, reform, forms of integration, together with the impact of economic austerity. Now, it seems to me that those issues, while extremely important, did not actually characterise this presidential campaign. This presidential campaign, it seems to me, was not characterised by any particular cluster of issues, except it reminds me a little bit of the 2010 UK election and the MP's expenses scandal, although it's not the same thing, of course, but there are certain aspects of this whereby the rejection of parties was extremely important in this election. The rejection of what were perceived to be normal political practices was extremely important. And of course the campaign just got bogged down in the history and the details of Monsieur Fillon, his arrangements with members of his family and his clothing habits. And in a way, that was interesting to follow, but it didn't actually allow a proper discussion of issues. Now, in a way, the primaries contradict what I've just said. They did put new issues onto the agenda, and I think particularly about Benoît Hamon and the universal revenue, and to some extent, Fillon, in order to win the Republican primary, had a very clear message in a way, a clear message about what needed to be done for the debt and in order to get France back to where it should be as the leading European nation. But in a way, those issues were it seemed to me, were a little bit diverted in the campaign. The campaign became a rather messy affair. It became a very nasty affair, actually, in many respects. Of course, the nastiest episode in that campaign was the presidential debate, if we can call it a debate, that we witnessed on Wednesday. That was down on the street, really. It was at the street level, certainly for Marine Le Pen. And so I think that's the second point. The third point is about the actual dynamics of the campaign itself. And, I think we can identify a few key themes. One is, in a way, as I said, the policy vacuum. Another one is the people against the elites. It's interesting how all of the five main parties framed themselves as being anti-party, paradoxically. not just the three parts, not just Mélenchon, Macron and Le Pen, but also to some extent Hamon and Fillon. Fillon was talking about le peuple. Hamon was clearly criticising to some extent the legacy of his own party in office. There was no one defending, finally, the legacy of the Hollande presidency. Which one might say is a pity, because there was a legacy, and someone should have been defending it, perhaps. Well, that's perhaps a normative judgment, but in a way there was at least enough to defend. And what really strikes me about this campaign, and Raymond said this, is it's the fact not just the sitting president wasn't a candidate, but also that there was no one to defend, in a way, that programme of that policy record. Now, clearly Macron defends some aspects of that, but clearly Macron's argument was rightly in a way that, well, he was restricted when he was in government. He wasn't really able to do what he wanted to do, and if you elect him president, then he'll have a free hand. But so I think that's a slightly approximative debate about a policy. And then just the final point, because I don't want to tread too much on Helen's terrain, but this whole European issue. What was interesting about this, it seems to me, Macron's the only pro-European candidate, really, the only explicit one saying, listen, we actually need to move on. We need to think seriously about how to integrate further the Eurozone. We need really to think about what the next stages of European integration are. Other candidates were not talking about the European issue at that level. But what was interesting, really, was that the European issue itself was not really properly debated. And when it started to be debated, when Marine Le Pen's whatever she's doing with the Front National plan on the euro that no one understands really, when that started unravelling, then at last we had a little bit during in the debate we had a little bit of discussion about being worried really about what was going to happen if Marine Le Pen gets elected. Do they actually know what they're going to do on this issue? And so I think there, clearly. A lot of the cephalological analysis, which I'm not going to go into, but those lovely maps that are reproduced in Le Monde and so on, that all demonstrate really that La France périphérique was certainly more inclined to vote for Marine Le Pen, and clearly in the métropole in Paris, also in Lyon, Macron did extremely well. We sort of adopted Macron in Lyon actually, because the local Lyon political class adopted Macron early on. Not just Gérard Collomb, the socialist mayor, but also Michel Mercier, the centrist head of the department, the Rhône department, and so on. So Macron's is almost a local son, really, for people working in Lyon, which is beside the point. But let me just conclude and say, Helen's going to talk all about Europe, but this has been a really fascinating election. Is it the realigning election? Well, we don't know yet, actually. I think it's too early to say. We'll have to see what happens with the parliamentary election. I think it's been I don't want to go into future scenarios, but clearly the real meaning of this presidential election will depend somewhat on the next series of elections and on the outcome of the parliamentary contest. So there might, for once, we might need to think, well, is it actually the decisive election, the presidential election? Maybe this time it might well be the parliamentary one.
Thank you very much for that. Helen?
Oh,
sorry, Rainbow?
Yeah.
Rainbow, my apologies.
Alistair was actually kind enough to set up my talk by smoothly transitioning into the parliamentary elections, which is what I want to talk about. And as Raymond mentioned earlier, the parliamentary elections are normally a bit of an anticlimax. Everyone's got voter fatigue and everyone knows what the outcome's going to be because the president's going to get a majority, boom, boring. And this is the first time since the two election cycles were harmonised that the parliamentary elections are actually quite exciting and very important. He's going to face a very difficult 5 years. And if he faces a difficult 5 years, then the 2022 elections might make the 2017 elections look tame and predictable in comparison. Because if we've already rejected the left and the right and now we're taking a chance on the centre and that falls apart, then what's left? Le Pen. So it's important for the stability of French politics that we have a productive 5 years ahead of us, and for that to happen, Macron needs, and I'm just going to take it for granted, if you don't mind, that Macron's going to win on Sunday. Macron needs to have a parliamentary majority that he can get on board with. And normally, in the history of French politics, we're faced with one of two scenarios. Either the president has a parliamentary majority, in which case the president rules okay, parliament pretty much does the president's bidding, the prime minister is pretty much the president's lackey. Or we have cohabitation, where another party has a majority in parliament, and sorry, at that point the prime minister becomes, at least for domestic policy, the more important figure, and the president becomes relegated to sort of head of state, foreign policy role to a large extent. Now, if Macron doesn't get a parliamentary majority in the parliamentary elections, which is a significant possibility, we might find ourselves facing a new scenario that we've not seen before. Because if he doesn't get a majority, it looks extremely unlikely that any other party will. So we'd have a situation of minority governments. And what's more, we wouldn't have any other parties that could credibly band together to form a majority against En Marche. Because Macron's party sits in the middle of the political spectrum. So for his policies to be overturned, you need left and right to cooperate with each other against him, which is unlikely to happen. So what we could end up seeing is a candidate who has pinched ideas from the left and the right and is now trying to pinch politicians from the left and the right, potentially forming different coalitions on a policy by policy basis, depending on what he's trying to get through Parliament. So there might be times when he's able to form an alliance with the Republicans, there might be times when he's able to form an alliance with the Socialists, assuming that his own party, such as it is, doesn't get a majority. Now, the current polls are sort of suggesting that Macron may well get a couple of hundred seats, maybe more, in the parliamentary elections. So at this stage, to be taken with a pinch of salt. There's a lot of uncertainty. For him to get any seats at all would be impressive, considering that his party, if you can even call it that, it was just a social movement it was founded a year ago. So at present, we are, 6 weeks away from the parliamentary elections, and we're looking at a party that has never contested an election, and currently, officially speaking, has no candidates. So if they are then going to be the dominant force in Parliament for the next 5 years, that's a really extraordinary situation. Why do they not have any candidates? Well, it's not for lack of enthusiasm. In fact, Macron put out an appeal to people who'd signed up for En Marche, inviting them to put themselves forward as a candidate. He needed 577 people. He got nearly 15,000. And that has actually, in some respects, proven a curse, because he hasn't got much time to filter out the unsuitables and whittle 15,000 down to fewer than 600. And the task is complicated further for a number of reasons. First of all, he has to see which established politicians want to get on board with En Marche. And people have to decide whether or not they want to do that. There are some centrist-leaning socialists and Republicans who have already lent their support to Macron, who felt disillusioned with their own parties or with their party's own candidates, who might be willing to join Macron's fold, but he's insisted that if they do so, they have to resign their own party label and officially become a member of En Marche. And that is quite a big ask. It means that they would be turning their back on their political family, that they would be potentially standing for election against a candidate from their own political family, who might be a friend or colleague, someone that they've worked with for a long time. It also means that if there is a situation of a minority government, then they are going to be sort of placed in opposition with people that they used to work with. So they might feel that it's safer to hedge their bets, stay in their own party, but be willing to cut deals across the parliamentary floor as required. So that's the first complication. Who out of the existing political elite wants to get on board with En Marche? And until that's clarified, and no one is really going to put themselves in jeopardy until Macron is confirmed as president. So until that's done, then he's not going to know which other seats are up for grabs. And he's bound himself further by making two additional commitments. One is gender parity, which officially all parties are signed up to, but most parties don't actually implement it. And to the extent that they do, they tend to have women candidates in seats that they're not really going to win. Whereas we don't really know at this stage which seats En Marche is going to win, and you can't tell either by looking at the national trends, because each seat has its own individual dynamics locally, which could be compounded by the presence of 3 or 4 candidates in the second round, which makes it even harder to predict. So without any incumbents, without a clear sense of which seats are winnable, we might actually see a degree of gender parity in En Marche's selection. But he's also committed, and this is unprecedented, he's committed to drawing 50% of his candidates from civil society, people with no prior political background. If Macron manages to get a couple of hundred or more deputies in Parliament and honours that commitment, that 50% of them are going to be political neophytes, that is going to be a degree of political renewal that has never been seen in France. No one comes into politics cold from nowhere. Everyone has some, local office, or working their way up through the party ranks, or working as a parliamentary assistant, or being a former minister. Having people actually coming in from outside politics would be a very, very interesting scenario. And what it would do to the image of politics would also be really interesting to see, because one of the reasons why we saw so many giants fall at the early stage of this election is that there is a real genuine appetite for change. There's a fatigue with the status quo. So it's going to be interesting to see what these people can bring to politics, how they adjust to the political process, how the political process adjusts to them, and where they sit in this new political order where we no longer see a traditional left-right standoff, we no longer see a traditional parliamentary majority. So I think we are facing a scenario of completely uncharted territory coming up. My final comment is that there's also a kind of lack of clarity as to what the Republicans and Socialists are going to be doing going into these elections. The Republicans have just announced that François Baron, I'm not pronouncing that well, is going to lead their campaign. Perhaps less tarnished than some of his rivals by the primary election, so he's still got a little bit of political capital left. But he's not even a member of Parliament, not of the Assemblée Nationale, he's a senator. So we're having someone who's not a deputy leading the elections to the Assemblée Nationale, which is interesting. And then the Socialists have a severe leadership gap at the moment. Hollande is finished. Valls got defeated in the primary, Hamon got trashed in the actual election, so they need to regroup and figure out how they can try and get themselves back in the game after what's been a difficult 5 years and a really bruising half a year just gone. So I will stop there and hand over to Helen.
Our last speaker is Helen Drake, who's going to focus, I think, on France and Europe, the EU.
Let's try.
Let's try.
Okay. So, first of all, thank you, Ingin, for inviting me, and Raymond for suggesting me. And it's always nice to meet my UK colleagues out of the UK. Sometimes it's in America, and now it's Paris. So it's really good to be together. So it was 60 years ago that France, under the Fourth Republic, signed the Treaty of Rome, and that means that for 60 continuous years, France has been a member state of the European Union. And whoever wins on Sunday, whoever wakes up as president, as it were, will usher in some sort of break with the past. There have been previous breaks and ups and downs and so on. And whichever whichever natural phenomena metaphor we want to use, ripples, explosions, whatever, earthquakes, there's going to be some sort of movement, let's put it that way. And so I thought, well, where can I go to get some sort of factors to analyse this? And you said to me, we should talk about what we're most concerned about. So I've taken you rather literally, and I've tried to create a very crude risk register for French and EU relations, depending on who wins. And I'm going to play the game. If only for contrast, I think Macron will win too. But let's have a look at both candidates. So in formulating this very basic risk register, of course, I thought of Brexit. So using Brexit, using the lessons of, we don't have Brexit yet, Britain is still a member obviously, but we're heading that way. So I sort of looked at the Brexit scenario, if you like, for, I think I've got 4 headings, and I'm going to run each candidate through those headings. And I've used a very crude traffic light system. It would have helped if I'd had a visual, but next time I will, a coloured visual. But you all know the traffic light colours, red, amber and green. So I'm kind of, I think I preferred it before, but anyway. So let me just run you through the factors that I've come up with. So the first of the 4 critical success factors, if you like, is plan or no plan. Do the candidates have a plan? And bearing in mind that I'm taking my lessons from Brexit, and a whole sort of issue around Brexit was that there was no plan. Secondly, can govern or can't govern. So if we think about Theresa May and the UK Prime Minister and her current method for governing Brexit, to call elections, to try and consolidate her majority, well, I shouldn't really get into that. But to what extent is the winning candidate, the president, going to be able to govern? Third factor, this is the first take, okay, so I'm looking forward to to you helping me refine it, is what I'm maybe calling leadership legitimacy. And in the UK case, in the case of Brexit, I'm thinking about where did the media stand? And I'm talking about the trashy tabloid media in particularly, and all their discourse about the will of the people and the judges as the enemy of the people. What about public opinion? And a bit of a sore spot for us lot is, what about experts? I started off my class 5 months ago with a big badge saying, "Don't trust me, I'm an expert." And my point being that in the UK context, questions of legitimacy did cover this matter of expertise. And then the final one I've got is Brussels capital. There's a pun, as in, what are relations with Brussels? So, for critical success factors, and I come out with a sort of a sludgy colour at the end, some mix of red and amber, or amber and green. And let's take the candidates in turn, and I struggled a bit with my alphabetical order, then I thought, no, I'll do this easily. Marine Le Pen has styled herself as Marine, so I'll start with Macron. So, Emmanuel Macron, did he have a plan? Yes. There is part of his manifesto, it's not a manifesto, but he has talked about Europe. We can come back to this later, so he's, and Alistair, you talked a bit about it, more Europe, more EU-level sovereignty and action, some sort of democratisation. So he's got a set of, I wouldn't necessarily call them objectives, but he's got an idea, a plan. So I put him green on that. Secondly, can he govern? Well, this is what you two have been talking about, and in particular you, Rainbow, the extent to which Macron may or may not have a parliamentary majority. But what I'd like to point to, it comes back to you as well, Alistair, is to do with the presidency itself. So on the face of it, the president in the past, has done European policy. So think about Mitterrand, they've sort of made it their own. But at the same time, European policy is very much, Hollande said, "I make no distinction," he said in 2012, between the European, international and the domestic level when I'm doing politics. Can't imagine a British politician saying that. And in terms of government as well, I mean, I've said elsewhere that in his style, in his leadership style, for example, Macron is probably more pedagogue than demagogue. He makes me think of an old favourite of mine, Jacques Delors, but I've got to really come back to that because there are lots of differences too. So can he govern? I think I've given him an amber. And this is on Europe. Does he have legitimacy? Well, I've just talked a little bit about his leadership style. I do think in that debate he held his own. He's got, Raymond, you started off by saying I can't remember what you said, but he's very talented. So I think he's got some leadership gravitas. But in terms of, and I'm using this term sort of loosely, in terms of his legitimacy, obviously he's been, Le Pen has tried to tarnish him with being a banker, an oligarch and so on, to which I would say, yeah, but he left the bank. And he's now in politics and started up his movement and so on. So, and in terms of legitimacy, thinking about Brexit, I think in France there is less space perhaps for sort of rank demagoguery, and there isn't really the tabloid press. And I don't get the feeling that as experts we're quite so pilloried, but we can come back to that. Fourth criteria, so I put him amber as well on legitimacy. And Brussels capital, what about his capital with Brussels? I put him green here, as in he understands that the EU functions on bilaterals, and he understands about the Franco-German relationship and the Franco-British relationship, the love-hate, he's entered into that. He's an Anglophone. Can he speak German? I don't know if he can speak German. But when pushed by a journalist the other night, he said, no, France is not going to be face à Bruxelles, we're going to be with Berlin, we're going to be with Berlin. And he plans to be quite sort of robust in the Franco-German relationship. So we'll see. He comes out there for a kind of a sludgy green, somewhere between green and amber. Okay, that's where is he here? So he's this sort of quite unpleasant green colour down here. Let's turn to Le Pen, or Marine as she has styled herself. Does she have a plan? As you said, Alistair, it's true that Europe wasn't really discussed properly, and she sort of melted down really. Well, not that she would see it like that, but you know, on public television in front of 16 million viewers, she seemed to quite gaily get completely lost on the ECU, the euro, and so on and so forth. So, but her plan, memories of David Cameron here, is to renegotiate. So she plans to go to Brussels right when Brussels is renegotiating Brexit, you know, the British exit. But she's going to renegotiate. She's talked, as you know, about coming out of the euro and also of a referendum. And she's got the power to do that. I give her a red for her plan. Stop. Can she govern? Well, as president, she says she's going to call a referendum. She can call a referendum. We can talk about the treaty articles and so on. Yeah, so the same point really, she gets an amber too. It's the same point applies about what sort of majority would she have, what kind of presidential domain would she have, and what does she, you know, how would she deal with Europeanisation? So amber. What about her legitimacy? This is interesting. You know, her leadership style is to be this demagogue and to be, well, I mean, you only have to, I refer you to Wednesday as to her style. And in terms of her supporters, you know, she's very much, she makes me think about in Brexit. You know, we had a bit of a mad summer where the people, well, I think it's still like that in Britain, isn't it? You know, we're down with the people and Parliament, and the judiciary can go hang themselves. So, you know, she very much plays into that will of the people, expert bashing type of language. That's where she wants to draw her legitimacy from. As I said before, I'm not sure that the terrain in France is quite so fertile as it seems to be in the UK or over Brexit. So she gets amber, it's not a red. Where she does get a red is the fourth factor, what is her capital in Brussels, I'd say pretty low. You know, one of the features that was physically bruising, as you said, Raymond, on Wednesday, was her Germanophobia. And this is something that I find, you know, it's quite easy to detect in political discourse here in France, a bit more generally anyway. So she doesn't seem to have any finesse. I'm not comparing her with Mrs May, but there is, you know, there's this sort of perhaps like lack of diplomatic experience and so on when it comes to Brussels. So on her four, she gets another sludgy colour, a kind of a dark amber. So it's a mixture of amber and red. I don't know what you call that. If I was doing this properly, we'd have a 5-point scale. So to conclude, I think, obviously, as you said, Alistair, talking about context, this isn't here today. You know, the context is not Brexit. French public opinion is a little bit more positive about Europe than British public opinion before we went into the referendum. There's a bit more appetite in French public opinion for Europe doing more, okay, than there ever is was in the UK. I've sort of argued that maybe there is less space for this sort of tabloid type populist demagoguery language, but that's for discussion. But I think that the lesson from Brexit that I'll finish with is that changing membership status, changing EU membership status, whether it's Le Pen, Marine's type of change, or what Macron wants to do, it is fraught with difficulty. And to get back to my sort of rubbishy metaphor, you know, it's an arduous route with traffic lights at every single twist and turn. Thank you.
We've covered a lot of points in the 4 brief presentations, and obviously of necessity somewhat schematically. I'm now going to throw it open to the floor. If you're familiar with the BBC question time format, that's the kind of format we're trying to reproduce. I had initially thought I would try to structure questions right, but maybe that's too ambitious. We were happy to field questions about Hollande and his legacy. 2 of us have mentioned that was about the primaries. I know that this all seems like ancient history, doesn't it? The news cycle moves on so fast. What happened last November already seems like Noah's Ark. The primaries, the future of the left, the parliamentary elections, France's relationship with Europe, can the president get a parliamentary majority, all sorts of questions. So, and I'll try to allocate a question to, I think, who's perhaps best suited to answer it. So it's over to you. participatory democracy works if people participate. Yes.
Yes, I have a question about the future of the left and the France Insoumise movement, the future of that movement, both maybe in the next election, in the parliamentary election, its future as a political party that may represent more and more of the left, or its continuing status as a sort of Mélenchon cult of personality. So sort of what future for this movement, which is one of the most striking things I thought about the first round.
Thanks very much. I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions and then maybe let's see if I can give my panel here, because I'm just chairing this, I'm like the 2 journalists in Wednesday evening, I'm hoping my role will be a lot easier than theirs. Yes.
We're not punching each other, which is a good start.
Yes.
My question is basically, this is the first election we're having under the state of emergency. So
Yep.
what is this idea of the narrative of fear and the politics of identity? Often we fear, especially in France, this language of fear is there, and then what is this national identity? Is there a place for non-white, non-Christians in this dynamic, especially leading to the parliamentary elections?
Okay, that's a good question. Take one more and then we'll do. Yes.
Coming back to the point that my fellow member of the audience, we've seen some very interesting things happen to the British Labour Party. Is there some kind of parallel to Corbyn destroying the British Labour Party and what the system of primaries has done to the French left?
Okay. Let's so maybe, Alistair, do you want to? You're an expert on parties. We know you are. Maybe the questions 1 and 3 are kind of related because they're about the future of the left as well as Mélenchon, the France Insoumise. A left that's always been fragmented in France, so we shouldn't be surprised at that. But is the current state of the left, both the Socialist Party and then the broader left, is that new, or is that something? Is that more continuity than change, to use that old cliche about French politics?
I think that's an excellent question. 2 excellent questions, really. I'll take maybe the socialists first in the primaries, and then I'll come in and give my take on the La France Insoumise. I think really the Socialist Party has been a big, it's been in agony for a long time, really. If we think about it, the last, if we go back in history, well, let's think about 1993. The socialists, they got 67 deputies, I think. They actually performed not too badly. They got 19% or whatever in the legislative elections. But even then, we were saying clearly, is this the end of the PS? The PS came back, did well under Jospin, but didn't get through to the second round in 2002, and so on and so on. But I think in a way, the schism really between if you like, the governmental left and the radical left, this has been present. It's probably been present in some form or other throughout the whole history of the French socialist movement. But it's certainly accelerated, I think, post plural left. And we really did see, I think, in the Hollande presidency, I think really, almost from the inception, the Hollande's ability really to function effectively as a government was greatly undermined, I think, by the state of relations on the left. Those relations are extremely difficult. I don't see actually how in the future the PS, however it puts itself together for the parliamentary elections, I don't really see that there can be a cohabitation of forces like Valls and Vals's supporters with the Hamon people, because in a way Hamon didn't really represent the traditional left, it seems to me. Hamon represented very much the Greens, an alternative positioning clearly for the socialists, but really didn't represent the heart, I don't think, about that. Coming on to, so I think basically the socialists are at a turning point in their history. I think it's really not looking good actually for the future of the PS. Now clearly we mustn't totally underplay them. They're still controlling a large number of departmental councils. They did pretty well actually in the 2015 regional elections. They've still got the big cities. The memberships ebbed away, but there's a real sort of infrastructure around the Socialist Party, which means that we can't just dismiss them straight away. But there is, I think, a real crisis. It's a real turning point. There is not a community in a way of spirit within what remains of the Socialist Party. And I think that gave an opportunity clearly for La France Insoumise, but clearly the success of Mélenchon goes well beyond the left, I think. I think Mélenchon clearly was able to mobilise strongly on the left, but clearly the success of his campaign in 2017, I think, goes well beyond, to some extent, the boundaries of the left. He was mobilising other people, particularly strong support amongst first-time voters. I mean, it's extraordinary when you actually look at the figures who voted for Mélenchon. Whether that can translate itself into, Mélenchon only, he did say that he was looking for a cohabitation with La France Insoumise as being the main party, but I think we can take that with a pinch of salt. And I don't see how really this can translate into massive electoral success for Mélenchon. I might be wrong, but clearly there will be deputies. I think his behaviour in between the two rounds has confused a lot of people. It's confused a lot of his own electors, and I think to some extent he had an extraordinary end of the campaign, but blew it really in between the two rounds. So for the future of the left, I'll stop there. It's a bit difficult to see really. I think the old Socialist Party, as we know it, will undoubtedly fracture, either during the elections or shortly afterwards, undoubtedly, and I think that a fraction of that party will be looking very seriously to support Macron, and Macron, in spite of everything, might actually need those people to support him. So I think a reconfiguration, I'm not sure where that leaves the old Socialist Party.
Thank you. One thing to bear in mind when looking at the Socialists and La France Insoumise and at the state of political parties more generally is that the presidential elections are not always a good indication of the broader health of a political party. Parties are big machines and they operate at many different levels within the French state. And one big difference between the Parti Socialiste and the France Insoumise is that the former has a huge national party apparatus and the latter doesn't. And this is something that is also an issue for En Marche. They don't have that local implantation, they don't have a whole bunch of locally elected officials that they can rely on. And bear in mind that the senators, the upper chamber of parliament, are elected by locally elected officials. So La France Insoumise is going to struggle to build on Mélenchon's momentum because they don't have the follow-on. In much the same way that Modem has failed to build on the momentum of François Bayrou, who in 2007 got 18% of the vote, which is comparable to Mélenchon, but only got a scattering of parliamentary seats thereafter, and he's never really managed to establish them as a major force in France. The Socialist Party, the reason it hasn't withered and died despite its huge internal divisions is the fact that if you look at the bigger picture, there is a very solid party there with a lot of loyal people within it. It's certainly taken a bashing over the past few years, so I think it's wounded, but perhaps not fatally. And so I think we can expect to see it do some soul searching over the next few years, possibly have a splintering, but I suspect, despite the fact that Amon won the primary, I think the electorate more broadly are probably closer to the Val's end of the spectrum than the people who participated in the primary. So I think that strand may end up becoming dominant, and perhaps the more radical left who have been rebelling against the Hollande presidency for the past 5 years might end up splintering out of the Socialist Party, but that remains to be seen. To the other question about, where does this leave the non-white, non-Catholic France? One thing that I found encouraging, one thing I found disheartening about the last couple of weeks, it's perhaps been disheartening that we have not seen the same degree of mobilisation against Le Pen that we did previously. She no longer has the shock value that her father did. When Jean-Marie Le Pen got into the second round in 2002, it was called an earthquake. When Marine Le Pen got into the second round, people went, oh, she came second, not first. I thought she was going to come first. So her presence was normalised, and because of that, it hasn't triggered the same degree of reaction and shock, which suggests that the racist underpinnings of her argument have also been normalised, and that is worrisome. On the other hand, we've also seen a certain degree of unification and mobilisation around Macron. The major political parties have rallied to him rather than to the Front National. Even figures who've been trying to court the Front National over recent years, such as Nicolas Sarkozy, have come out and openly said, come on everybody, Front Républicain, and let's vote for Macron. We've seen religious leaders get together. What do Protestants, Muslims and Jews in France have in common? That their religious leaders all got together and said, vote for Macron. So that's a rare show of unity that people want to come together rather than supporting the politics of hate. So all of that is encouraging. The stance that Macron himself has taken is encouraging. He's made a point of reaching out to the Jewish and Muslim communities, demonstrating that he is concerned about the history of these communities, their future within France, and welcoming them into the fold. So whilst I think there is genuine cause for concern at the growing electorate of Le Pen and the growing tolerance of the intolerant, I think we can also take comfort at the political response to it. And as a final point, I'd say it's worth bearing in mind that not everyone who supports Le Pen is a racist. A lot of people who support Le Pen are disaffected with politics for other reasons, are disappointed with their lack of economic opportunities, with their purchasing power, with the perceived threat of globalisation on a sort of economic scale, that they are willing to support a candidate who is racist indicates a certain lack of moral compass, but it would be, I think, misleading to suggest that everyone who votes for Le Pen therefore hates foreigners or hates everyone who isn't white. So I think it's perhaps not quite as bleak as the figures might suggest.
Maybe I could just add a bit on that, your question about the politics of identity. I was looking from an more international or comparative perspective. I don't think that France in 2017 has escaped what we could call, in a shortcut, politics of identity. Thinking about the US, thinking about Brexit and so on. I think here in France, the question is, well, which identity are you referring to? So there's quite a lot of discussion and talk about class identity and the fact that class identity, in particular sort of working class identity, hasn't disappeared and any more than the left-right kind of distinction has in how people identify themselves. Well, you mentioned religion, and obviously you came back to that, Rainbow, and whether you like or loathe Michel Houellebecq, I think it was interesting that on France 2 last night he said that he was quite intrigued that religion, and he meant Catholicism, had sort of made a comeback in this election. And he was talking in particular, as far as I can follow his thoughts, about the Les Républicains, Fillon in particular. And then a third sort of level of identity or identification is the national. So of course our minds kind of go to Le Pen, I suppose. And there is, there's been some, so again on TV last night they had this thing, Les Deux France, and then in the FT, Simon Cooper wrote about going back to Charles Maurras's sort of theories of les deux France, le pays réel et le pays légal, and sort of and Simon Cooper's perspective on that he wrote in the FT just this weekend, that he's written this week, is that the sort of fault line identification with le pays, whether it's the national or the sort of the terroir type pays. I mean, his argument is that what we see in 2017 is sort of almost 100 years old. I'm still working my way through that to see whether I sort of buy into that or not. And relating to that, you talked about the narrative of fear in the context of the state of emergency. And I suppose, I do think that's a real fault line between the two candidates. Macron, was it Carrefour that had that strapline, if en positive? So he does have, I think he quite strategically picks apart or tries to counter those sort of politics of fear and the language of fear, whereas Marine Le Pen, it's her stock in trade, isn't it? So again, sort of trying to draw a Franco-British comparison maybe Yeah, I mean, the context is sort of for peace, isn't it, for fear, given the state of emergency and what have you. But I do think there are differences to be drawn between France on the one hand and elsewhere on the other. And between the two candidates, it is a big difference, I think.
I wonder if we could just come back to the third question, which was the French left in Corbyn and the primaries, because the primaries were seen as a kind of success prior to this year, you know, and the legitimacy they gave Hollande in 2012, that was seen as a big success of the open primary. This year, the conventional wisdom is that they failed. You know, they were very, lots of time was spent on them, but they produced, in inverted commas, the wrong candidates. And I suppose, in a sense, that was your, likewise, the leadership contest in the United Kingdom produced the wrong leader for Labour. That's what I understood from your question. So there's a kind of conventional wisdom is now building up. A new wisdom is primaries. Maybe they're not such a good idea after all to open up. Against that, I heard one commentator on French television who said, well, okay, but if you hadn't had primaries this year, who would you have had? You'd have had Hollande, Sarkozy, Le Pen, exactly the competition that 75% of the French electorate said, we do not want that again. So, where does that leave us in terms of primaries? What is the balance to be struck between letting people choose the leader or the candidate, and if you like, letting the elites choose the people to choose the leader and the candidate? Any comments on that front? Thanks for that, very good question.
I'll just say a word on the primaries. I mean, I think it's an excellent question, and it's true, we didn't really answer it before. I think, in a way, it is true to repeat the fact, that in a way we, to some extent, what was the Republican primaries were deemed in November to have been a great success. They mobilised well over 4 million people. And clearly they produced, a lot of public interest, and they produced a candidate who represented the balance of those people who turned out for the primaries. Now, obviously, the people who turned out for the primaries were those identifying with LR, but nonetheless, it was actually a tremendous exercise in mobilising that particular community. And I think the problem, in a way, with Fillon, I think the real thing about the primaries is it's a mechanism. And once you've chosen that candidate, then the Fillon case showed, but also the Hamon case to a lesser degree, that it's actually impossible to then get rid of that candidate. So the mechanism of the primaries just this time around was clearly that when it started to go wrong for Fillon, given that Fillon just refused to admit really that it was going wrong, then there was actually no mechanism at all to get rid of Fillon. And so Fillon hung it out, and he wasn't actually that far off getting through to the second round. But nonetheless, he didn't get through to the second round. So in a way, the primaries, it's not just who does the primaries select, but in a way, how do the primaries become institutionalized in a way? They're the primaries to elect the presidential candidate. Does the presidential candidate then produce control over the party? Well, not in these cases, clearly, because the presidential candidates failed. But to some extent, I think that's an important question, not just about who the primary selects, but also about to some extent, the aftermath of the primaries. And so something, what's the future of the primaries? Well, it's clear that on the right, they don't want any more primaries. No one really wanted a primary. It was just, it was originally to stop Sarkozy stitching it all up. Let's not forget that. So in a way, it was imposed upon, to some extent, the Republicans. I don't think there'll be another primary for the LR. I think, to be frank, on the left, it's very, very difficult to see how the existing Socialist Party can really internalise that process of primaries, except to say, well, look what's happened in Italy. What's just happened in Italy? Renzi, after having stepped down, has just come back. He's won the Democratic primaries in Italy. It's re-legitimised him. So, but clearly that's a different sort of primary. Selecting a candidate as against selecting a leader, it's not exactly the same process. Primaries, I think they're symptomatic of a deeper sense of distrust, really, in French political institutions and parties. And when one looks, final point maybe, when one looks really at the Sevipov, the incredible barometer that the Sevipov have been producing, and when one looks at the degree of distrust in general of political parties as organisations, then in a way the primary debate is perhaps almost a secondary one, given to that fundamental distrust that appears to have manifested itself in this election.
Thank you, Alistair.
I think maybe on primaries I go even further. You know, you talked about the most institutions and mechanisms. Well, I mean, there is an argument that the primaries, the party having primaries, somehow denatures the presidential system, and I think Macron has talked about this somewhat ironically, given that he kind of benefited really from who was knocked out in the two primaries. But there is an argument, and also you said earlier, Alistair, that the sort of policy issues got a bit sucked out. You know, they were dealt with in the primaries, and then they didn't really sort of perhaps come back in as strongly in the actual election. So there is an argument which you know, I'm quite interested in engaging with, that the primaries are perhaps some sort of distortion of the Fifth Republic and of the nature of the presidential election to a point. And just on that, I think again, Macron's been quite interesting about. It might just be Macron the candidate as opposed to the president. He's been quite disparaging really about Mélenchon's support for a Sixth Republic and his sort of attack on the Fifth Republic. And I think in the debate, you know, as far as I could follow with all the shouting and all the everything on Wednesday, I think Macron was making some sort of points about this is the system we've got, this is the presidential system we've got, this is how the Fifth Republic functions, and we need to let it function. And so I think I would see the primaries in that context as well, of what it means to have a two-round presidential system. You're going to argue with me, aren't you?
No. Later, Helen, but I'm not straight away. There's just one brief point I was just making. What's really interesting at the moment, I think, is how Macron refers back to the crisis in Algeria, the creation of the Fifth Republic, and he's clearly framing En Marche as a sort of latter-day version of the UNR, you know, as a presidential rally. Not a real party, but a party that will rally to the president. And in a way, that's going back. That's one version of what is a presidential party in the Fifth Republic. So I think Macron's interesting. He doesn't play at all with ideas of Sixth Republic, but he's really going back, to my mind at least, to a very, very early version of what the Fifth Republic might be. But let's not forget that General de Gaulle in 1958, the UNR didn't actually get a majority. The biggest party didn't actually get a majority.
You want to come back in, just very briefly?
But I was thinking myself that the primaries are, in a way, changing the presidential election from 2 rounds to 4 rounds.
Yes.
And that is an issue because it was developed, of course, in the States where people are registered Republicans and Democrats, and it all makes sense because they belong to the party and the party belongs to them. But here, in a way, it's open to anybody who identifies at one particular point in time with such and they have the sign they identify with. But in fine, they're not party members. In fine, they have no responsibility for their decisions apart from the €2 they put on the desk when they...
There were closed primaries in the past, and then they become open primaries. Yes.
To a certain extent, philosophically, the closed primary is much more sane because it rates the party and its representative more to the party members.
Yes. That is an argument that I've often heard, and there are French political commentators who make that argument. So yeah, that is an argument that certainly can be made. Although in the case of Corbyn, I'm not so sure whether you would agree with your own general point there. Did you want to come out of the primaries?
Yes, please. I think there are basically 2 problems with primaries, with that stage of the election process. The first is that they allow you to air all your dirty linen in public. So even before you've gone into the election, you've allowed your own party to discredit all of its candidates by bashing each other. And I think the best example of that actually isn't from France, it's from the US. Bernie Sanders pretty much destroyed Hillary Clinton before Trump ever got in there. And it also led to the problem that, one of the reasons why Fillon couldn't be replaced was because all the other candidates have been discredited as a result of that primary process. The other problem is what we political scientists call May's law of curvilinear disparity, or just May's law. And May's law sounds funny when you're talking about it in the British context, because obviously the Prime Minister's called Theresa May. And so the big problem facing the Labour Party right now is May's law. But That doesn't mean the laws introduced by the PM. It means the notion that party members are more radical than the electorate as a whole. They are more committed to a particular ideology and are therefore further away from the centre. And that is what we've seen in the Labour Party. That's why we've got Corbyn. That's what we saw in the French primaries, why we ended up with two candidates that were actually not that close to the median voter. And to some extent, that's also what happened in the American Republican primaries. That's how they ended up with Trump. So that is the kind of the second risk. And May's law is contentious, which is why Raymond's kind of shaking his head. I'm not sure about that.
I just think Royale in 2006 was the consent. She was chosen because she was the one who they thought was going to win the election. You know, so there was, you know, and along in 2000. I mean, this year maybe it's just slightly different.
Yeah, but you're rolling the dice. If you allow the members to decide rather than the more electorally minded party elites, then be careful what you wish for.
Okay, let's take that point. Let's throw it open again. Some more questions. Questions about Le Pen. Questions about Macron. Suddenly the hands went up. Yes, and then I'll take three again.
Okay, this is not a question actually about Le Pen and Macron, but more the European context and trying to place this in the sense of what's going on generally in Europe. And I'm thinking here of Poland and Hungary and some of the countries who are also calling for changes in Europe because they joined a Europe that hasn't turned out to be what they expected, perhaps. And you know, I think you've got different views on that. So I'm wondering what your views are about just generally how France, Britain, certainly, how people are no longer agreeing that what was signed up for in Europe is actually what we've got now, and how is that going to be
All right,
back?
I think Helen's probably best placed to answer that one. I'll take another couple and give Helen some time to think. There are three questions. So the lady in the middle. Oh, David Dimbleby here. Yes. Yes, you.
I don't want to add on to that because I want to ask a question about political imagination in the media mostly. Because in the Dutch election, it was framed very much as a win for the liberal left, which was a grave misunderstanding of the Dutch political system, I think. And I was wondering, in how much would it win?
You mean framed outside of the Netherlands? You mean like?
Yes,
like,
outside of the Netherlands.
yes.
So it was framed as a win for the liberal
Right.
left, which
Okay.
I think was a bit of a misunderstanding of the way the Dutch political system works. And I'm wondering, how far would a win for Macron be framed in a similar way as a win for the liberal left, and how much would that also be a misnomer of some kind? And that's just sort of in political imagination in Europe, but also more generally worldwide. How would his win be framed, and if it were framed as a liberal win, how much is that a misunderstanding in itself
Okay,
as well?
so we're talking about Macron's values and whether the perception of Macron's ideological stance, inverted commas, whether it's accurate. But when you say where it will be framed, you mean it will be framed outside of France in this context?
Exactly,
You mean,
yeah.
but like as in Anglo-American media?
International media.
Right, okay. It's a good question.
United States media.
Good question.
My question is regarding Mélenchon and
Hungary, Poland. We've signed up for things. Well,
Yeah.
United Kingdom has decided to leave the camp, but the Europe that the countries sign up for isn't the Europe that they have.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the question was about the status quo of EU membership in different member states and the extent to which that's challenged. And I think we have to maybe be a little bit wary of putting all those countries. So you mentioned countries from Central and East Europe, and you mentioned Poland and Hungary. And I suppose it's worth saying that these are countries that for whom the entry criteria into the European Union was far more stringent than anything that the UK had to face. You know, and they haven't sort of benefited as a rule from the sort of special status that the UK certainly benefited from. And I think that, so I would say that there are perhaps national exceptionalisms or so-called exceptionalisms when it comes to the reasons for challenging the status quo of EU membership. That's not to say there aren't sort of alliances and ganging up and so on. And I mean, we go back into the mechanism of how Brussels works and how positions get aggregated and so on and so forth. And whether we talk about the European Parliament or in the Council, which is where the European Council, which is really where the business is done. So that would sort of be my answer to that. But it does, I think, link into the second one, which I really like that about how will Macron's win be framed. You know, I'm from the UK. And we don't do subtlety, and in terms of the Anglo-Saxon media in the UK, I'm talking about, so I'm saying that in the UK there is, and then I'm thinking of Brexit here, using my Brexit filter. You put me off, Raymond, because you're kind of
No.
grimacing.
I mean, the Scotch do subtlety, I can assure you.
Yeah,
of
they
that.
do.
We're absolutely renowned
Yeah.
for it.
Yeah,
The
they
English
do.
may not, we certainly do.
So what I'm getting at really is that there's already been a kind of a labellisation, a shortcut to describing the candidate. So in the British media, for example, and in particular in the daily tabloids, it's fairly straightforward the ways in which Macron is framed and in the way Le Pen is framed. In fact, I met a journalist earlier this week, and he said, am I right in thinking that the UK media actually want Le Pen to win? You know, and I mean that reflects and represents a way of framing, a lack of political imagination, I would say, in the way in which we try to understand. But it's also the case that there are national filters in Brussels too. There's a filter. So there are sort of categories. And of course, you mentioned the word liberal, and I'll finish on that, because to be a liberal, sort of in French discourse, usually means to be Anglo-Saxon and to be kind of an ultra-liberal. It comes with the rider, doesn't it, with the prefix ultra. Whereas to be a liberal in the UK sense, sort of almost immediately kind of points to social issues and matters of that kind, rather than of market economics. So I think in terms of how his win would be framed, we have to, there will be labels and shortcuts, and then there'll be kind of, discursive, almost linguistic filters that won't necessarily sort of illuminate the debate. But I'm not sure it would be wrong to cast him as a left liberal. I'll finish on that.
Is Le Pen a National Socialist? No, she's a welfare chauvinist. Which is to say that she wants more support for the French people, but the welfare state is only for French people at the expense of everybody else. So that is a sort of distinction that she makes on sort of nationalistic grounds. But it is a way of trying to temper the far-right image by sort of offering things to people from sort of more economically deprived backgrounds. But it's worth bearing in mind that the FN has two rather distinctive electorates, and different messages go out to each of those electorates. So in the north, which is sort of Marine Le Pen's stomping ground, she's targeting the sort of disaffected working classes, whereas in the south, which is Marianne Le Pen's stomping ground, there it's more about sort of middle-class, petit bourgeois, rural Catholics. And so the message going to those two groups is sometimes contradictory, but that's the FN for you. And the, sorry, what was the final question? Go on.
My question is on?
No, go behind you.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, since you've got tension from the centre with Macron's win and with Sarkozy's strategy to move towards the right to get the FN vote,
I don't.
Have the same split as the socialists, or is that just a temporary thing?
Well, what to do with the Front National has been a growing problem for the Republican Party. Do they form an alliance with them and try and sort of join electoral forces? Do they try and steal their votes by usurping their policies? Do they try and stick with the cordon sanitaire of Front Républicain and refuse to engage with them? The strategy under Sarkozy was called Nini, neither nor, that they wouldn't engage with them. The fact that they have come out to support Macron, even if indirectly, is an indication that they are not yet tempted to move over to the far right.
Okay. Can I say a word about Macron?
Yes, on your time. You've had more time than the other two, so I'll have to be very strict.
Just very briefly on Macron. I think what's very interesting is if you look at the amazing panel that the Sevibuff have been carrying out, and you look at the most recent one, which was just this week, it sort of demonstrates really that Macron will be elected, that's for sure, there's no question about that. But there's not a massive movement in favour of Macron's policies. You know, there's not a real commitment on behalf even of those people who identify closely with Macron. There's not a real love really for Macron. And there is, of course, amongst a certain number of marcheurs, but you know, there's not a real commitment. And I think we mustn't forget with Macron, there's this final point, that Macron also has a dimension that is a bit populist. I mean, he criticises parties, he's against intermediary institutions. Macron's platform is interesting, was determined not really in a very orthodox way, certainly was determined using tools of mass political communication and to some extent determining, for example, this the commitment to remove the taxe d'habitation from 80% of French taxpayers. I don't exactly know how that will play out, but whether that's been fully costed or not, I think is a real question. So in a way, Macron's programme itself has not really been subjected, I don't think, to the analysis that it might have been in a different context. And let me just say one final word. I think in a way, I agree with Helen on liberal. It's true that liberal in the French context means something very different. Macron's come pretty close to sort of, not calling himself a liberal, but certainly making a justification based really on a form of the need for economic adaptation, liberalisation, but together with, in a way, almost in a Tony Blair sort of sense, really saying, you know, we need to marry economic efficiency with social protection, and we need to be pro-European. So in a way, is this not just a form of Tony Blair with 20 years or so delay, possibly?
We're soon approaching the moment where there's going to be a competition between intellectual pursuits and free wine.
Free wine.
Free wine. Free wine wins hands down. Okay, so let me wrap up there. I just want to say that this is the first of two events that we're holding here in Europe on the French elections and French politics more generally. On Tuesday the 23rd of May we're holding a second event, which will also be a kind of roundtable like this. But to differentiate, we've invited the chief, let me get her title correct, Chief Paris Bureau Correspondent of The Guardian, Angélique Chrysafis, and she's agreed to talk for about half an hour on the coverage of the campaign and how a foreign journalist covers a French election, and also to talk a little bit about her views on French media coverage. And that's something that we haven't talked about today. It was a big part of the campaign, you know, Hamon, Mélenchon, Fillon criticising the media, so a lot of criticism from candidates. Well, on the other side, people saying Macron was the candidate of the media, created by and for the media. So that aspect that we haven't talked about at all today will feature very centrally when we have a discussion on the 23rd of May. Thank you very, very much indeed for coming. Thank you very much for your questions. I hope you've enjoyed the evening. My thanks to Helen, to Alistair, and to Rainbow for their participation, to Engand for organising it. And now we move seamlessly, effortlessly from the contested campaign to the ambience of wine and nibbles somewhere in the building. And Engand, you're going to tell us where? Here. Here! There we are, just here. Thank you very much indeed, everybody.